Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sydney Robinson. I'm the Symposium Chair for the Harvard Negotiation Law Review. And welcome to our Symposium on Restorative Justice. Today's panel is going to be about preparatory restorative justice and its iterations across the globe. And with that, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Andrew.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second panel discussion as part of the HNLR Symposium. So thank you to HNLR for hosting this event, and I think we'll have a terrific time this afternoon. So my name is Andrew Mamo. I am a clinical instructor at the Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program and a lecturer in the Negotiation Workshop. And in a moment, I'll introduce our speakers. So this panel, as hopefully you all know, is entitled Using Restorative Practices to Address Communal Harm Internationally. We'll have three great speakers and then some time for Q&A. For those of you who are just joining us for this second panel, welcome. And to those of you who have been to the other events as part of the symposium, I hope you find some connections between this event and what has happened over the past couple days. And as a reminder, later today, there will be a screening of Fumble Talk that you're all warmly invited to attend. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. The first speaker will be Thalia Gonzalez, who holds an appointment at Georgetown Law School and Occidental College in political science. She's a nationally recognized expert in restorative justice with more than a decade of experience in law and policy. Professor Gonzalez's work centers on intersectional issues of civil rights, the school-to-prison pipeline, race and inequality, and juvenile justice. On these topics, she conducts research, publishes articles and reports, and provides guidance to policymakers, educators, lawyers, and advocates at the local and national level. She's published in leading journals, including the New York University Review of Law and Social Change, Howard Law Journal, Cardozo Journal of Conflict Resolution, Fordham Urban Law Journal, Ecology Law Quarterly, and the Journal of Law and Education. She is a frequent expert speaker at conferences and commentator on legal issues and educational and juvenile justice policy, and her work on restorative justice has been featured on NPR, in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Huffington Post. Thalia has done extensive research on the Maine Wabanaki State Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which she explored in her online conversation about truth-telling on race relations in the U.S. context with Carl Stouffer, who some of you may have heard earlier this week. Our second speaker will be Ronan Feehily, who has worked as an academic on 3 continents, and his research profile reflects the global reach of his publications. His research interests lie primarily in the field of international commercial dispute resolution. An award-winning researcher, he is the author of 19 peer-reviewed journal articles in leading law journals in the US, UK, Australasia, Africa, and Ireland. He is also the author of 2 books and edited the book Governance, Globalization, and Dispute Resolution. With a background in legal practice, Dr. Feehily has worked as a lawyer and as in-house legal counsel. A senior lecturer in law at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, he's also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and a CEDR accredited mediator, and has practiced as an arbitrator and mediator. A native of the northwest of Ireland, his interest in restorative justice practice emanates from their effective use in bringing the 2 communities together following the conflict in Northern Ireland. He is currently writing a book on international mediation, drawing in part upon the use of mediation as an instrument of transitional justice in such contexts. And our third speaker will be Libby Hoffman, who is the founder and president of Catalyst for Peace, a US-based private foundation building peace from the inside out, creating space for those most impacted by violence to lead in building the peace, supported by healthy, inclusive systems. She co-founded Fumble Talk, Family Talk, in Sierra Leone, which created the world's first national-scale, fully locally owned and led reconciliation program, and is now pioneering national people's planning process and developed a national policy framework for it in partnership with the government of Sierra Leone. She produced the multiple award-winning documentary film Fumble Talk and is a lead author of the companion book, both released in 2011. A former political science professor at Principia College, Libby has an MALD from Tufts Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA in political science from Williams College. She has delivered 2 TEDx talks, Forgiving the Unforgivable and Justice in the Round. She's a mother of 3, and she and her husband live in Falmouth, Maine. So with that, I'll turn it over to Thalia.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. It's always really weird to listen to yourself being introduced. So that's probably where you saw me being like, oh. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I do want to also share my thanks to the Harvard Negotiation Law Review, and then also to the Program on Negotiation, and to Andrew and to Sydney for shepherding me around for the last couple of days, and also getting me the largest cup of matcha tea I've ever had in my life this morning. And really, I'm so honored to sit with Ronan and with Libby this morning as we open up this conversation. So I am going to turn my phone on, not because I think it's important for me to have my phone, but because we were given a very short time frame. And so I want to be attentive to the time we spend together. So I really want to open with sort of a broader context to thinking about communal harm, and then enter into a little bit more of a specific conversation about what we see here in the United States. But it really is an overview, and my hope is that then in the context of our conversation and our Q&A, we can dig in a little bit deeper. So trauma and harm, as we think about either structural oppression or state-sponsored violence, exists in many forms, right? And it's saturating our world, whether we're talking in a very localized context here in the United States or from a global context, meaning that it's in our neighborhoods, it's in our hallways, it's in our playgrounds, and it really exists within the fabric of our communities. And I think that there's been an attempt, when we look at communal harm, whether it be through government officials, policymakers, or even civil society, to look for almost totalitizing narratives. And I think that that's a failure in doing so. And so those monolithic explanations become inadequate. And so I think at that point, we really have to take a more pluralistic view on what communal harm means. And then the entree point from that is to say, well, then what might be pluralistic responses and remedies? And I would posit for all of us that that's where restorative justice might fit into this framework, in that whether it's embedded in formal processes or existing in deeply local contexts, that we have the opportunity to think about this as one praxis to addressing communal harm. And I use the term praxis because I think restorative justice does exist both as a theory and a framework and a set of values that guides us, but then it's also about a set of practices that become adapted and adopted to whatever those sets of conditions are at a given time. And so like Fommeltalk, the use of restorative justice in the United States relative to communal harm really should be understood as a communal process where it's shared spaces, where we're facilitating these encounters between individuals, and that it's not about an abstract idea of community, which I think we so often have a very abstract narrative of the community, but it's organized in, with, and by members and individuals within a particular community, and we recognize them as individuals with the dignity and humanity and respect that they deserve in that context. And so I think, this is where we see an animation, whether it be the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Maine Wabanaki State Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or some of the work that's being done in these non-formal processes, to think about what is the reality of violation and harm, but also what is the alienation from human beingness. So how do we take a more holistic look at revealing that complete and complex understanding of the causes and consequences of events? And that's a really different way of entering into the conversation than simply a punitive or retributive or formalistic lens. And so in that sense, it's not just that a mechanism for truth-telling, right? It's about broadening the scale of the political and the social and the economic conditions that are implicated in continuing communal harm. So it's also not a singularity of event, right? And I think that we have to be clear that there is the sense of inequality that is permeating both a historical context but a set of current lived conditions. And that if we don't pay attention to that we really aren't really starting to reveal the possibilities for change. So I don't know what Carl said, but he and I have sat in similar spaces together. And one of the ways that he has often discussed restorative justice, and I'll sort of take from him a little bit in this, is that restorative justice is a form of justice, and we'll sort of put quotes around it, that demands accountability, meaning that it's that recognizing of harm and taking of responsibility, but it also is that it makes clear that no act that destroys human dignity should go unnoticed. So again, it's unpacking a set of larger social conditions and experiences beyond just that moment of singularity of harm. And I think for many of us in the field, we think then that accountability creates an avenue for reconstruction, and that there are different possibilities for that reconstruction, whether that's equalizing power, whether that's the democratization, whether that's restitution, whether that's reparations, whether that's reconciliation. And so then the practices of restorative justice then become the physical embodiments of those values. And I would actually argue then it's about reorienting, restoring, and redefining power. So it's not just the individual narrative, but it's the collective. And that then reinforces either formal political demands or informal demands for recognition of dignity and respect. And so that's also creating spaces to hear and listen to the voices that have always sat at the margins. And I think that's an important piece to how we understand this. But we also have to be critical, right? So how do we ensure that restorative processes and practices are avoiding doing more harm than good, but also that participation and agency is actually embedded in this, and that if we are deeply concerned about the denial that has occurred for individuals and communities and being at the margins and experiencing communal harm, that we don't just rely on sort of replicating the same systems. And so, while the ontology and the theory is really important, you all are probably not here to hear me talk about just that. So I do want to point to a couple examples here in the US as a catalyst for what our subsequent conversation might be during Q&A. And I really do view this as a conversation, so I thank you for being here in this way. So the first is probably one that you've heard about. So I'll talk about some formal processes, which is the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Greensboro. So it was embedded in a 1979 attack by the Ku Klux Klan, and ultimately then a series of murders, and that there was a failed formal justice process. And so 20 years later, there was organizing within the context of the community to figure out what might be possible. And that was really then looking to a set of international models and importing different characteristics of that to come up with using the TRC. And in 2006, a report was issued, and there was a formal recognition of communal harm. And restorative justice, both as a value and as a set of practices, was embedded within that TRC. The second was the one that Andrew alluded to that I've worked on, which was the Maine Wabanaki State TRC. So now we're moving from something that was at the city level to actually at the state level, where you have, and it's historic for many reasons, but it's historic in that you had the recognition of tribal sovereignty, in that the 5 Wabanaki chiefs were actually signing an agreement for the work to begin in the mandate with the governor of the state of Maine. So the state of Maine was also recognizing the sovereignty of the Wabanaki people and the historic harm that was happening relative to Indian child welfare. So it wasn't just about sort of 1978 to now, right, in terms of that harm, but it was really looking in the contemporary reality, which existed, which was, if you were a Wabanaki child, you were 5 times as likely to be removed from your home than white children. And so there was a really deep understanding. So again, 1999, you start to see the growth and the possibility, the looking at outside models, and then ultimately in 2015, a report was issued, and I brought a copy because there aren't that many original hard copies still floating around, and I'm very honored to have been given one of these. And again, it was about the use of restorative practices both before, very deeply and importantly, but in a unique cultural context, in the Wabanaki context, and honoring that as a set of traditions and not just importing a Western idea of restorative justice. And then now after, and to be very candid, the hard work is actually after. And I think my colleagues would probably echo that. If we shift to thinking about more local models, and not to suggest that Detroit, there was one in Detroit, and we can talk about why maybe I'm not giving you as many details about that. So Greensboro and in Maine, that gives you sort of the more macro level. At the deeply micro level, there's truth-telling projects that some folks here might be familiar with. So if you're from Chicago, you know that there's a Black Women's Truth Commission that's bridging the divide, that's actually focusing on Chicago police and the communities in which they operate. There's the Ferguson Truth-Telling Project. Here, Northeastern, right, has the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Institute just down the road from you guys. Kellogg has a whole initiative that they funded up across the country. And then also Equal Justice Institute, obviously, there's been a strong focus. But from that, there's also then a deep use of what's called healing circles. And so both in Chicago and in Oakland, there's been the growth, whether it's hubs in Chicago or it's being sort of called a collaborative network in Oakland, of actually moving the whole city to being a restorative city. But those hubs are serving as sites of deeply communal work to start to address the long-term historic harm, but also then how we see that played out in the contemporary lived experience of individuals. And then the last thing I'll mention, and I hope perhaps there's interest in this, is that avoiding a top-down approach in Milwaukee, there's been a really strong focus on having this being youth-led and participatory, so that if a value of restorative justice is about democratizing and about seeing the dignity and worth, that it's no longer just about us as adult practitioners who are gifting young people the possibility of engaging in a restorative practice, that it's actually bi-directional and not just the co-thinking of what it might look like, but the actual work. So in Milwaukee, at the Alliance School, students are the circle keepers, not just in their school, but actually now out in the community. They're referred cases from juvenile justice. So they're seen as the experts in the same way that anyone else is, and they're very much focused in the work within the community about how and where, from an intergenerational standpoint, do they really start to approach and think about addressing communal harm. I'm totally over my 8 minutes, and I'm really sorry. So I will stop right there.
Thank you, Andrew, for your introduction, and thanks also to Adriel and Sydney and the HNLR for organising the event. It's a pleasure to join Thalia and Libby as part of this panel today, although I suspect my focus will be quite different from theirs. Hailing from the northwest of Ireland, where my focus is very much on the use of mediation as embedded within restorative justice practices in that part of the world, and its effective use in bringing the two communities together over the past 20 years, how it's worked well within each community, and how also it's managed to bring each of the communities towards the state or their understanding of what the state should be. Mediation as a form of community dispute resolution is nothing new to Ireland. It was very much part of our customary indigenous law that dated from 2300 BC through to the arrival of colonial courts of English origin in the 17th century. So when we think about the use of mediation within restorative justice initiatives, we are very much returning whence we came. It would be a little overly ambitious in terms of giving background to what I want to speak about, to distill 800 years of Anglo-Irish history into 8 minutes. But in terms of the relatively recent history, Irish independence in 1922 resulted in the partition of Ireland between Northern Ireland, which comprises 6 counties in the northeast of the island and pledges allegiance to the United Kingdom, and an independent Ireland comprising the balance of 26 counties. Since the foundation of the Northern Irish state, it was very much characterised by structural sectarian discrimination, and this led to clear social and economic inequalities between the two communities, and ultimately to conflict between 1969 and 1998. And this period was known as the Troubles and resulted in the deaths of 3,526 individuals. The central issue between the two communities was, of course, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. Unionists and Loyalists wanted to remain part of the UK, while Nationalists and Republicans wanted British withdrawal and a united Ireland. Unionists and Nationalists generally followed constitutional means, while Republicans and Loyalists generally followed paramilitary groups and physical force means. A peace deal agreed in April 1998, which is dubbed the Good Friday Agreement because of the day in which it was signed, created a power-sharing government. And that was, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the fact that it was chaired by George Mitchell. While the agreement confirmed that Northern Ireland was part of the UK, it provided that Ireland could be reunited if a majority of the people determined that it should be so, both in Northern Ireland and in Ireland itself. And the UK Parliament was to devolve powers to a new assembly that was created in Belfast. And the agreement has contributed to a sharp reduction in violence, and the annual conflict-related death toll, which peaked in 1972 at 480, has fallen down to single digits, which is still more than what one would like, but is a significant reduction nonetheless. 2 decades on, most of the agreement has been implemented, and while powers were devolved to Northern Ireland in late 1999, political turmoil in the province prompted the UK government to reimpose direct rule in 2000, again in 2002, and while the government was restored in 2007 and seemed to be functioning well up to 2015, in January of 2017 it collapsed once again, not for tribal political reasons, but because of allegations of corruption, which, as odd as it sounds, is actually a good point of normality in that part of the world. While the agreement was a transitional document and was not expected to resolve all of the issues or conflicts between the various communities in Northern Ireland, its major failing, its significant shortcoming, was its failure to facilitate or provide for the facilitation of dealing with the past. The Good Friday Agreement itself only gives a passing reference to the past, and many of those who are directly affected by the conflict still feel that they were betrayed and very much abandoned as a result of that. In terms of the initiatives themselves and community leadership, while the Troubles may have officially ended, the paramilitary ceasefires and the signing of the agreement did not lead to a complete end to the violence in Northern Ireland. And following the agreement, sectarian attacks between the communities led to a new cycle of degradation. And that was physically expressed by peace walls, which were 10-metre high walls between the two communities in Northern Ireland that developed, particularly in the first 10 years from 1998 through to 2008. Punishment violence formed part of an informal system of justice and could involve anything between shootings and also beatings for the purpose of punishing those who committed crimes or engaged in what was characterised by paramilitary groups as antisocial behaviour or as a means of internal discipline within the paramilitary organisations themselves. Measures such as warnings, curfews and exclusions from the community were also common, and these, what might be called policing activities undertaken by Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groups within their communities, originated during the Troubles, when the police were engaged in trying to subvert terrorism and didn't have time to police what we might characterise as ordinary crime. The police were viewed as an illegitimate force in Republican communities, and if you've seen murals from Northern Ireland, you might see on the walls of some of the houses in Derry, you're now entering Free Derry. And that was to symbolise that that was a place where police simply didn't go, that it was very much policed by Republicans. So the informal system of justice also signified a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Northern Irish state and resulted in significant and high-profile contests between the state and community about the ownership of justice and the ownership of the criminal justice system itself. Restorative justice projects were consequently initially established with the explicit intention of providing non-violent alternatives to punishment violence as practiced by paramilitary groups in both communities at the time. And it also offered paramilitaries, particularly Republican paramilitaries, the ability to give up violence without engaging directly with the police. And that was quite a powerful thing because the IRA in Republican areas of West Belfast and Derry were seen as the legitimate police force. So they couldn't be seen to deal directly with the police in the initial period of the transition. While community restorative justice initiatives began to develop from the margins following the first decade since the agreement, they subsequently moved into the mainstream and less controversial position. Similar to approaches elsewhere, community-based restorative practice in Northern Ireland has taken several forms. The mediation has really formed the central plaque of most of the initiatives, including victim offender mediation, group conferences, and shuttle mediation. And since their inception, their practice has broadened considerably from supplanting systems of violence through to crime prevention with young people and engagement with disaffected youth, victim support, and the reintegration of prisoners following their release in consultation with the police and with the probation service. The organic nature of the practices in Northern Ireland is an indication of the flexibility of the restorative justice initiatives and how they've worked both practically and politically in the region. There are two distinct projects, the major ones which I would mention, one in Republican areas called Community Restorative Justice Ireland, and the other in Loyalist areas called Northern Irish or Northern Ireland Alternatives. Both were established and are led by former political ex-prisoners and former combatants of the Provisional Irish Republican Army and the Ulster Volunteer Force respectively. And the presence of these individuals, as you can imagine, caused quite a lot of controversy, both within Northern Ireland and internationally. However, it's because of the presence of these individuals that they have been crucial in providing moral, political, and military leadership, because they were the ones with the credibility at the grassroots level who could convince paramilitaries to stop their attacks. The organisations are also supported by a very strong grassroots ethos, and the emphasis on local community members as volunteers very much provides the moral authority and the legitimacy at the local level to challenge and educate both paramilitary organisations and the wider community in non-violent approaches to conflict resolution. And this is particularly important, as I mentioned already, in a context where the legitimacy of the state and the criminal justice system were very much questioned by the minority community. And today the projects are the most effective method of communication and cooperation between communities and the police are among their major proponents. So in large part, because of restorative justice, Republicans have moved from a situation where they wouldn't cooperate with the police to now they sit on policing boards because of a restructured police force. And that's largely down to the capacity of restorative justice to facilitate that change. So Community Restorative Justice Ireland operates in 8 different areas, in Republican areas in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland Alternatives in 5 Loyalist areas. And following the first decade of their existence, there was very little cooperation between the two groups. But in the past 10 or 11 years, that cooperation has increased. And it's gone beyond the tribal politics to look at the sort of issues that affect people from what they call working class areas or lower socioeconomic areas throughout the region of Northern Ireland. In terms of concluding challenges or what are the limitations upon the capacity of these fantastic initiatives to do even greater work within communities, across communities and between communities and one's understanding of the state, the 2 periods during which I lived in Northern Ireland, the most astounding aspect of life there is the identity of people and identity politics. People don't associate as being Northern Irish. They're either British or Irish, despite the fact that in a couple of years, Northern Ireland will celebrate its centenary. I think only about 7% of the people identify as Northern Irish. And that translates into the social status as well, and also into the schools in which the children go. There are very, very few interdenominational or mixed schools in terms of unionists and nationalists. That said, despite the inconsistent nature of politics, as I said, the start-stop nature of the assembly that has been suspended on so many occasions, the restorative justice initiatives have very much come from the grassroots and from the community, and their success is because of the community leadership involved. The greatest, when you speak to those involved in the restorative justice initiatives in Northern Ireland, you ask them what's required for these initiatives to work more effectively. The answer universally from all of those involved is time. What they need is more time, because 20 years is quite a short period in the trajectory of 800 years in one form or another of different conflict. In terms of threats, without doubt, the greatest immediate threat to the restorative justice initiatives is the return of a hard militarised border in Northern Ireland. And if you've been following the debacle that is the Brexit negotiations between the European Union and the United Kingdom, you can see that at the moment things are very, very unclear. In the event that there isn't an agreement between the EU and the UK on Brexit, then it's likely that there will be a return of a hard militarised border, which will be seen as very much by Republicans as a betrayal. And remember, in the last 20 or 21 years, you have an entire generation of individuals who have no memory of the conflict. And the memories that they do have are very distorted, because there's never been any way of dealing with the past. There's never been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's never been any mechanism to effectively deal with those memories so that clarity could be provided to a new generation. And as a result, if there is a return of a hard militarised border, that would no doubt be a huge publicity drive for dissident Republicans and indeed loyalists to return to conflict. And it would inhibit the progressive work that has been done by Community Restorative Justice Ireland, Northern Ireland Alternatives, and I have no doubt would ultimately reignite sectarian tensions in the region. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll add my thanks to those of you who helped bring this event about, and I'm really grateful to be here and to share this this time with you and be a part of this conversation, which I think is a really important one. I'm going to give you a very different kind of perspective, and that is from the perspective of how does this work, restorative justice of communal harms in an international context, in practice, and do a deep dive into practice in one context, which is the context that I've been in, working in Sierra Leone. And I have also the great advantage of being able to show a film this evening that gives you some of the stories, the really compelling stories that have emerged from this process. So for my remarks today, I'm going to focus less on the stories and more on the process and some of the things that I think are significant about the process. Now, Sierra Leone had an 11-year civil war that ended in 2002, and they, in that war, there were over 50,000 deaths, over 10,000 child soldiers, tens of thousands of women and girls were raped, and over 2 million people, which is 1/3 of the country of Sierra Leone, was displaced. When it ended, they had a special court that was a hybrid national, international special court that indicted 13 men, the 13 men deemed most responsible for the conflict. There had been 9 convictions resulting from that. 3 have either died or are missing and presumed dead. And that whole special court cost $500 million. Sierra Leone also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which ran for 2 years, and it produced a massive, a lot bigger than the report of the main Wabanaki TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it did produce a lot of record of some of the stories to document a lot of what happened in the war. But what happened was, because it was not a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, that is, people already were given blanket amnesty as a part of the peace treaty that ended the war. There was no incentive for perpetrators to testify. They already had amnesty. So you had a lot of perpetrators that didn't testify. And second of all, the commission was structured in a way that it was held in the capital city of Freetown or in the capital cities of the districts over a course of a very limited number of days. And so most people that were impacted by the war did not have access to the TRC process, any way to participate or any way to meaningfully engage in reconciliation. After the TRC, then you had the government saying, okay, forgive and forget, now forgive and forget. And on the other hand, you had people in communities living literally next door to the person who might have amputated their arm or raped their mother in front of them or burned down their house. And this was across the country. And there was no recourse for addressing any of those harms. And you can imagine that there would be no capacity to move forward in any kind of a constructive way as a community as a result of this. So in 2007, I met a renowned human rights advocate, Sierra Leonean human rights advocate, John Cocker, who had been one of the leading voices behind getting the TRC established in Sierra Leone and had been advocating for it to be locally based and drawing on their culture and tradition. And he led the civil society arm of the TRC, but was ultimately frustrated at the lack of real reconciliation that resulted from it. And when we met, a brief word about Catalyst for Peace. We're a granting and operating foundation, and my interest was to create space for the people most impacted by war to be the ones who get to lead in the rebuilding after the war. And not to do that in just isolated ways where you have one really good local event process happening in a local place, but to think about how you can do that in a systemic way. What are the processes, ways of organizing, ways of building relationships from the local through the district to the national to the international that support healthy processes that really enable local leadership? So I partnered with John in 2007 to create this program, and we were a primary funder as well as program partner from the beginning. And we also documented it in film from the beginning, and that's the film that we'll be screening tonight, which is the stories are incredibly compelling. And what I want to do, let me just tell one story, and then I'll unpack that in a process, and then I think we'll be opening to questions. But there was on the far reaches of Sierra Leone, Kailahun district, there's a town called Dabu that was a rebel stronghold. And the rebels, when they came, people either fled or stayed, and those that stayed were deemed to either be rebels or rebel supporters. So after, the community was incredibly divided. Mariama was a woman who lived in Dabu, and they fled when the rebels came, and they buried their food. They all escaped except their daughter. And the daughter was captured by the rebels, and she was tied to a chair and beaten and, demanded, where's the food, where's the food? And she wouldn't tell, and they beat her to death. Mariama moved back, lived next door to Michael, the rebel who had killed her son. And they never spoke about what happened. At this Fambul Tok bonfire, and we'll talk a little bit about what they are, but this community held a Fambul Tok bonfire drawing on the Sierra Leonean culture and tradition of Fambul Tok, which is what which is the process that we revived and applied in this post-war context. Michael came forward. They had a community bonfire. He came forward. He was one of the first to come forward and said, I need to get this off my chest. I want to apologize for what I'd done. I did this. The community brought Mariama. She came forward and she said yes. And she said, I forgive you. And they embraced. Now, how did it get to that point? And that's what I want to just talk about in this little diagram that's up here. So in order to facilitate a process like that, and what is it that makes it happen and that makes it effective and safe, Fambul Tok, as an organization, would first go into a district, which is like a state. Sierra Leone is organized by districts, and gather the stakeholders in the district for a consultation. If you see, it all begins with consultation. And then they identify an all-volunteer district executive. So this is a small national staff at this point. Of the various stakeholders, has to be ideally equal numbers of men and women, victims and perpetrators, Muslims and Christians, all of the different stakeholders. And then they are empowered to lead the process in their district. They get training. And then they identify the community where they want to start working. So you spiral out. You hire a couple of staff from that community because they know the language and they know the culture. And then they spiral out, they identify the communities. Once you've identified the community where you're going to work, then you hold a stakeholder meeting in that community, and you bring together all of those stakeholders. And they identify communities, committees of youth that are outreach team, and a reconciliation committee. And these are people that are embedded in that community, that live there, that are respected. Not necessarily elders in age or official title, but level of respect. And again, men and women. They receive training. And then they are facilitated in the planning of this ceremony. So Fambul Tok doesn't plan it for them. They convene the groups and empower them, and they plan it themselves. So then that culminates in a bonfire ceremony, which, by the way, was what Sierra Leoneans said they wanted to do in order to achieve justice from their perspective, to bring back this ancient tradition of Fambul Tok, truth-telling, apology, and forgiveness around a bonfire in their community. And that's what they did. So they had these ceremonies, and then they were followed by reviving cultural cleansing practices, which took various forms in all the different ways. But so there was a cleansing ceremony afterwards. And then you'll see there's community meetings after that to follow up, and they implement things that stay on the community on the ground, a peace tree, or peace mothers groups, community farms, all sorts of follow-up activities that embed these rewoven relationships at the community level. And that continues for months, if not years. That whole process of facilitating to the point of the bonfire takes 3 to 4 months, and then there's months, if not years, of follow-up afterwards. So it's a long-term process. And it is, and this is sort of the main point that I want to leave you with, and I haven't been keeping track of time, but I think I'm at least at, if not past, my 8 minutes. The idea of reconciliation, for Michael and Mariama, it was important that it happened between the two of them. And the Fambul Tok process is a making of the community whole again. It's giving the community the capacity to handle its own wounds, to heal from its own wounds, and to rebuild and reclaim the capacity to then move forward together into development, which was their ultimate goal and the reason everybody gave as to why they wanted to engage. And just one final point of how is that all supported? Because it's rolled out in an organic and very emergent way. And it required a lot of then monthly staff meetings from the staff that were working in the various parts of the country, supported by biannual international or collective all-staff meetings, including the international staff, where people have a chance to come out of some select leaders have a chance to come out of the context and reflect on what's happening. And so the role of everybody outside the community, whatever level they are, is not about doing something for somebody. It's about creating a space and accompanying those people doing it themselves. And so embedded in that is a way, a concept of relationship that is really about creating space and accompanying rather than imposing from the outside in or the top down. And so it is a reconciliation, of the community, but also then if you look at the vertical structures that support that, it is in some ways a reknitting of the vertical levels also into a different kind of relationship and different kinds of power dynamics. I could talk a lot more, but I have tonight too, so.
Well, thank you for our speakers for teeing up a lot of really rich topics for us to explore in a Q&A. I guess just to kick off the Q&A, one question that's on my mind here at a law school where for perhaps many people in the audience, the place we naturally gravitate toward is courts and trials and all of that. In these situations where, for example, in Sierra Leone, you're describing a context in which there is an international tribunal, there's a TRC process as well as other things. I guess the question I'd like to sort of lead off with is for this audience, when is restorative justice the appropriate way to approach issues, and when are these more formal mechanisms or what have you perhaps more appropriate responses to events?
Well, my Sierra Leonean colleague John Cocker and I might answer that differently because I think he would say restorative processes are appropriate at any time. And I think he felt strongly that they would have been very effective right from the start. It is embedded in the culture, and so it's drawing on their culture and their tradition. As I reflect back, I think it's a harder question for me to answer in that context. I can look on our experience and say, I think the fact that there had been a special court and a TRC, not so much for what they had accomplished, but for what they hadn't, there's no doubt that provided fertile soil for this process to work. And I would also say that I'm not sure that it's even about as much a restorative process as it is the fact that the people themselves had the agency to choose, which I think can and should happen at all points. So if Sierra Leoneans, those most impacted, are determining what the best form of justice is for them, what justice looks like for them, I would say they should be the ones to determine that.
If either of you would like to
just in the context of Northern Ireland, restorative justice practices was really the only option, because as I mentioned, there was no agreement on any kind of mechanism such as truth and reconciliation. Primarily unionists opposed it because the obvious consequence of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is probably amnesties from those who are involved. They weren't prepared to do that. Equally, Republicans opposed it because they thought it was too soon to truth tell as such about many of the stories. And at the point the Good Friday Agreement was signed, paramilitary organizations hadn't even decommissioned. So the infrastructure to return to what they termed war was still very much in place. So I think restorative justice worked from the beginning and continues to work. The tragedy is that 20 years on, there still isn't any mechanism for truth-telling, and those issues persist, and that's one of the main problems.
I think I answer that question a little bit differently in that it depends on what your orientation is, right? Like, are you looking at restorative justice as the adjacent and complementary process, practice, or system, or are you moving it into the dominant paradigm, right? And so if we still accept that there's a dominant paradigm of punitive processes as the preferred, or at least the thing we're kind of comfortable with, even though we want to critique them, then restorative justice always sits as the adjacent thing that we sort of look to then to complete and fill the void that might exist. So I have to say that I'm probably a bit more in the camp of John, right? And that I actually do think that there is a time and place for restorative practices and processes, but that's a continuum of understanding what that is. That isn't just saying, well, one practice fits all. one process fits all. One harm is so monolithic that we can do this thing called restorative justice, and suddenly everything is going to be okay. So I think part of that goes back to the sense of agency. I mean, what might it look like in the United States if we didn't have a criminal legal system, but communities actually had the agency and control to be able to address the harm that happens in them? Because that's what the status quo is, rather than sort of having to work backwards and be like, well, our criminal legal system is deeply flawed. It's creating and replicating marginalization and subordination. It's pushing people into a prison industrial complex. So maybe we should do that thing called restorative justice to kind of stem the tide of that. Like, let's flip that, right? I mean, that's what New Zealand's done in the context of the juvenile justice system, right? Is that their juvenile justice system is restorative justice first and punitive second, right? And that has meant an incredible decrease in terms of how many young people enter into that system. So part of it is, what is the paradigm shift that you're offering, and even thinking about asking that question.
And if I can just build on that, because I think even in restorative models, like TRCs has become an imposed process. Yeah. And restorative processes are imposed in a lot of international contexts. So it goes to the question of how they're actually done and who gets to make the decisions. And then once those decisions are made, what are the processes and infrastructure that supports that? And I would agree. I think we need to flip and start from the standpoint that, that the communities should be the ones to ultimately to make those decisions.
Thank you. So at this point, we'd like to open up questions to the audience, and I think there will be a microphone going around, so please hold off until the microphone gets to you to ask your question. Yes, I think right there.
Hi. My name is Cyrus, and I'm here with my colleague Jamie. We're from Pine Manor College down the road in Chestnut Hill. I just had a question to Thalia's point about the paradigm shift. So I wanted to throw my hand up early because I was just coming off the comment that you just made about, if we assume a punitive standard, restorative justice is always going to be on the side and so forth. I feel like what you're also suggesting is that we, well, not that you're suggesting it, but we're an individualistic society. And as I come off of 13 years of living in Japan, which is so deeply communalistic, I empathize with the international students at my school who look at a lot of this and feel that it's a very sort of Americanized, superficial pop song version of communalism. Not to be disrespectful at all, because but I feel that and I hear it from them. And having lived in a much more communalistic society where, the order by which employees get into the taxi is determined by their seniority. I mean, there's all these things that you just wouldn't know. And it's all sort of in this deep web of historically rooted communalism. And so I wonder how we negotiate that slide in the individual community continuum. And I would say also, especially to make the question a little more focused, on a campus where there are a lot of international students from, say, East Asian cultures who don't take this in very well somehow.
So I'm still trying to suss out the question, Cyrus.
Sorry,
I'm sorry. Is the question about we free ourselves from the fact that this is a Western paradigm that criminologists like Howard Zerr in the 1970s suddenly called restorative justice, and we're sort of importing it? Or is it about how and where, if we either recognize that or don't recognize that the localized moment actually is the place where we're normatively shifting to a sense of community? Because I can certainly sort of think about that, right? Because that's, from an activist standpoint, in places like Chicago or Oakland and a whole range of places, right, the goal of having restorative processes, however you call them, actually is to revitalize and reinvigorate the sense of shared identity and community because it's been lost. Or more importantly, because it's been stripped away from communities, right? So whether that be because of a legacy of slavery, or because the state has operationalized the idea of marginalization and depriving and really stripping communities of their both economic, social, and political power, that the reclaiming of the idea of community is coming from the place to finally come together and sit together and talk. And that we call restorative justice, but I don't even think that's a fair characterization of it. So, but if your question is, well, then on your college campus, how do you start to repair social fabric? I think in some ways it's exactly to Libby's point, right? Which is, how do you start to investigate and interrogate the questions of lack of community, but then ensure that those that can lift that up are part of the deliberative process of making that happen. So maybe those students who feel like they're disengaged from that sit at the margins initially, but then become the ones that actually lead that conversation in whatever that conversation formally looks like. And I think that's the point, right? I think there has to be simultaneously a normative shift and a cultural shift that accompanies this idea of restorative justice, but I'm not even sure that the language of restorative justice is the thing that we ultimately hold on to in its totality. But it is about relationality. It is about a deeply different ecosystem framework and how we exist together. And that, the idea of like, we're in it together isn't just this sort of random idea that we kind of hope for or aspire for, but we recognize that that actually is the thing not only that binds us, but that really requires that we have care and attention to, and that is about human dignity. That is about reclaiming agency. That is about resilience, and that we can't do that as individuals, especially in the face of a whole host of ways in which the state has stripped that from us as individuals or from communities, depending on how and where your intersectional identity lives and exists. So I don't know if that in any way answers your question, but thank you for asking that question and for you and Jamie being here.
Back there.
Thank you all for your comments. It's just so full of information, and I wish you had much more time to talk about your expertise. But building off of that comment, one thing that I struggle with understanding how to facilitate community-led processes is, what if those processes, indigenous or local, in themselves marginalized? And I'm thinking, for example, in communities where there's gender marginalization that may be just a cultural part of their existence, do we let that be the local way of dealing with local processes, or the question of imposing some kind of Western ideal of gender equality? How do we assure that a process is actually restorative for all members of the community?
Well, I can talk about how we've done that in the Fumble Talk context, which is one context. So, and it's a very difficult place to be a woman. But Fumble Talk has it's in a way combined a peace building and a human rights perspective. And so it's structured all of these community processes that it's facilitating when you're doing it at the community level. It's committed to the value of full participation of the community. And that seeps in at every level. And so while they don't impose the process, if there's anything that they impose, it's kind of those values. So everybody has to participate, and you strive for equal representation of men and women. And in fact, in some ways, they counterbalance it and have more things, or things specifically just for women only, as a way of helping to even the balance. But so when they're forming a reconciliation committee, oftentimes a local chief will just pick their family members. So they have it's built into the process, a spot check process where they give them the values and the criteria. It has to be X, Y, and Z. And then they spot check. And if the chief has gone back to those old patterns, they say, nope, sorry, we're not gonna do it. At every meeting, the Fumble Talk staff, when they're facilitating, they'll make sure that the men and the chiefs don't dominate the conversations, and so you're inculcating. The other thing that they have to educate about is that they're not there to give money. In these contexts, the community members are expecting any outsider that comes is going to give them money. And so they're also shifting the expectations in that way too, and say, actually, you don't need money. You have the resources that you need, and we'll walk with you in this process. What do you want to do? So it's an ongoing education that has a values education component explicitly built into that in a very organic way. But so that's how, in that context, they deal with it.
Sorry, just finally, in respect of Northern Ireland, it's probably controversial to say one good thing about paramilitary organisations, because there rarely ever is. but they do believe in equality. So the role of women and men is quite equal. If you look at the Republican movement in Ireland, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, the leadership is women. So in terms of the restorative justice initiatives, once they took root, there was certainly equality in terms of the participants, those who were involved, and those who built up those movements. And as I mentioned in the contribution earlier, much of the resistance from the state was that concern that there were paramilitaries involved. But the values of the process very much developed with the initiatives, and they were just sort of loosely termed mediation long before they used labels like restorative justice to characterize what was happening in either Republican or Loyalist areas. And as I mentioned earlier as well, there's huge resistance to international models such as truth and reconciliation, and there continues to be. Richard Haas led an initiative a few years ago trying to come up with a formula that could work, and that's largely been rejected by the parties. So it's very organic, it's very indigenous, and I think restorative justice is just one way in which it could be characterized. That's why I spoke more about mediation as an instrument of transitional justice within the sort of restorative justice paradigm.
So I think I'd quickly say 3 things. One is that I think the early feminist critique was exactly this, right? And at least from the paradigm of thinking about women and girls, is how do we not replicate marginalization and subordination? But I think that that's actually a framework, especially with system adjacency, that resonates totally. 2, I'd say we don't let anybody do anything, right? Like, so I actually, and that's not to attack you, that's just sort of clarify my personal position in this, that my positionality as someone who does this work, both as a practitioner, as an academic, is that I'm not gifting this to anyone, I'm just creating space and then getting out of the way. And so to the extent then that if patriarchy is demanding a set of conditions by which people feel marginalized, my hope, right, is that in the organicness of that happening is that actually starts to be lifted up. And what I'll say from practical experience is that actually is what happens. But that can be a deeply slow process in the way that we as Westerners in particular, or those of us that are committed to human and civil rights, like we want it now, right? We want to know that this thing is dismantling whatever that moment of social oppression is, especially when we start to talk from an intersectional perspective of gender and race in particular. But I think there has to be a willingness and flexibility and trust, which is really hard as a lawyer, and I imagine as law students, because I sat in that seat many, many years ago. Like we have an expectation of something sort of happening performatively more quickly, and that we like things to be sort of neat and tidy, and restorative practices, approaches, philosophies, all of those things put together are inherently messy because it's about people. And it's about humanity. And it's about all the ways in which we show up on a given day that might be imperfect, and creating the space for that, creating a communal context by which you can show up in your imperfect self in that way and start to tackle and challenge those things, whether it be through fumble talk, through mediation, through circle, through dialogue, through dance, through art, whatever that is. I think that's what our job is, right? We, I think, have an ownership and a responsibility because of our complicity to be able to create those spaces. And then if we're part of that community, participate, but not necessarily if we aren't, right? And just really say, how do I step back and allow that, to use the more formal terms, local ownership sort of in that moment.
Any other questions? Yes. And 1 second for the microphone.
I apologize, I was late, but I really want to know more about a restorative city. And is it like a parallel city to the actual city? And what are the relationships with the police and the other forces that are going to ensure that things happen the way they should happen?
Anybody else want to?
Gilmore.
Yeah, I can, I suppose, address that first of all. In terms of the city aspect, I suppose Northern Ireland's quite small, so you could think of the entire country as possibly a city. But in terms of the relationship between the various initiatives and the police, as I mentioned earlier, initially there was huge widespread mistrust of the police in Republican areas in Northern Ireland, to the point where really there was no policing by the state. And the Good Friday Agreement provided for the possibility that an independent commission would effectively disband the existing Royal Ulster Constabulary and introduce a new police service for Northern Ireland. In tandem with that, the restorative justice initiatives, particularly in Republican areas, started working with the police on the ground. And resistance to restorative justice in Northern Ireland came from the state and senior management within the police, but police on the ground were always in favour of it, because they saw the potential for it in terms of bringing Republicans effectively in from the cold and getting them to work more closely with the police itself. Since then, and during the transition, restorative justice has been instrumental in ensuring that community workers and community leaders and Republican politicians work closely with the police, to a point where, as I said, they've now fully subscribed and fully support the police service, and they're seen as a legitimate force within Northern Ireland. I think had restorative justice and those processes not been in place, that would never have happened, and that reconstruction of the police force would never have taken place.
So here in the U.S., there's been a movement both in Chicago and in Oakland to move to being restorative cities, and that exists in a multidimensional layer. So that's thinking about something that is similar in how our police, because your question was specific to police, how are police being moved out of positions of power that are about acting in particular ways that are reaffirming existing system and structures, meaning that restorative practices are being used as alternative to traditional forms of policing, and that those are community owned. But restorative cities is also a movement. So Hull, Leeds, Canterbury, so UK, New Zealand, here as well, like there's sort of a consortium of folks that are thinking about this. Restorative cities also means that from top to bottom, that all the policies and practices that exist within within all of the scaffoldings of cities are being looked at and rewritten to be thought about in restorative ways. And that might not just mean then singular harm being addressed, but actually to this communal point about relationality. But that pragmatically could mean that, the way that caseworkers and child welfare are working with families, that you have something that looks similar to, say, family group conferencing as the dominant model, as opposed to sort of existing models that look in that way. That maybe in the context of your juvenile justice, that there's a continuum of ways in which young people are being moved away from being, I don't necessarily like the word diverted, but the way that young people are coming in contact with the system from the moment of actually police interaction, that police have the ability to not arrest, not ticket, because there is a restorative alternative that exists even at that moment. And then, we can get into like, what are the tensions, the gatekeepers, is that a good thing? Like, that's a whole separate conversation, right? But, so you would have that moment where from that all the way up to, say, post-adjudication, then there's ways in which restorative practices are being used as opposed to traditional punitive practices. It's also holding city meetings in circle, right? It's about policy, it's about planning, it's the whole messy, wonderful thing. And I don't think I can do justice in a short answer to kind of present some of that to you. I'm happy to have a conversation afterwards and also put you in contact with the people on the ground that are holding the monthly meetings in Oakland, that are holding the monthly meetings in Chicago, that are doing this work on a daily basis, because that's actually more powerful and more important than me sort of standing here and saying this to you.
What happens if the federal government has a whole different idea? I'm not very fluent on restorative.
What do you mean? Our federal government isn't terribly restorative? I don't know what you're talking about.
What is going to be, your way of getting around that?
Well, so we do have this wonderful thing where states and cities operate in very independent ways, and unless there's federal preemption, they get to do all kinds of fun things. States and cities are the laboratories for human rights, and really an evolution of domestic human rights. Cities like New York and Los Angeles are actually integrating the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, into all levels of what city planning and processes and documents look like. And our federal government is deeply not interested in SDG 5, for example, which is gender equality. The city for, the Cities for CEDAW movement, right? So the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that has been at the local level. Climate change, we aren't in Kyoto anymore, but magically a lot of our mayors, for example, have signed on to Kyoto and or are doing things within their local cities and then in their states. I mean, Los Angeles is the 5th largest economy. Well, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, right? And then you take Los Angeles as a larger percentage of that. Like, you can imagine then if Villaraigosa, the mayor, is signing on to a lot of these things and actually then putting into practice, that unless this administration, or from a traditionally legal standpoint, there's preemption, like, they have the full right and ability to do that. So whether you like the framers or not, right, they create a lot of protections for our states and our local governments to be able to operate in very independent ways. And I think that we saw a growth and responsiveness, especially in the human rights context, and that's ratcheted up even more. And I would argue that that's actually what we're starting to see in the restorative justice context, is that there's not going to be a national TRC tomorrow, right? Like, if there is, I will buy everybody drinks and dinner. So I feel pretty confident, right, that there's not going to be. But to the extent that at these, quote, local levels, that actually is the call and demand, whether it's a TRC or something similar, or really kind of deciding what should be adapted or adopted. There's a lot of flexibility. And it's then, I think, that falls on the shoulders then of community organizations, of individuals, of the thing we like to call civil society, to really demand that, but also then simultaneously a push within those formal structures to think about that happening. Or, because we're sitting in law school, we can point to this thing called law, is that there's been an operationalization within law. I mean, there are 45 states now and 284 pieces of restorative justice legislation. And I say that because I did the empirical analysis last year, right? Like, we're moving to where restorative justice, at least in its name, is being deeply embedded within a legal context. And so what might it be like for us as lawyers and law students and folks committed in whatever the spaces we move in, to take that and start to use that to transform what this is at the state level? Because there's not a federal law that says restorative justice, in the same ways that our federal laws don't say human rights in them either.
All right, well, thank you. There's been a lot on the table, and unfortunately, we've now hit 1 o'clock. So join me in thanking our panelists.